Hi, or hello, sci-fi and philosophy students. Today is our next to last online lecture. Again, as is my custom, I will look at some of the student criticisms and challenges to the Kantian ethics that were submitted for today. I'll try and give a Kantian response to these different questions and criticisms. And certainly I want to move on to talk some more about Kant's ethics. In the last lecture that I gave, I didn't really go into much detail on the two different expressions of the categorical imperative that are covered in our readings. That would be the principle of universalizability and a principle of ends. I want to talk about that stuff some more today. I'd also like to talk about how you can actually derive the principle of ends from the principle of universalizability. And so we'll get into that later this morning. Before I start responding to student writings, just a couple of things. Our last class, it will be this Thursday. The last YouTube presentation will be this Thursday. I won't introduce any sort of new materials. I'll post a homework assignment this afternoon. Everyone is to do the short writing assignment for this Thursday. Every one of you is to do it. And you'll be expected to see the movie Gattaca, which is a science fiction film that deals with issues concerning genetic enhancements and a possible future in which genetic enhancements could be widely available to people for human reproductive purposes. Anyway, and what I'll have you do is try your hand at applying the utilitarian moral philosophy and the Kantian moral philosophy to some of the ethical issues that arise in Gattaca. Also, let me remind you all that your final major papers, the third major paper, those are due on Thursday, April 30th at 2 p.m. I think that was the original due date for them on the syllabus, but regardless, also I would remind you that I made that third paper assignment last Thursday. You should have gotten last Thursday, April 16, you should have gotten that paper assignment. There are three options to choose from. Certainly as you are working on those papers, if you want to discuss the ideas, if you want to show me a draft and get some feedback on it, that all of that's fine and good. But if everybody's waiting till the day before to get my help on the paper, I don't think I'd be able to help everyone. So anyway, that stuff coming up. Let's talk some about Kant's ethics now. I received 4 short assignments. I think I'll try my hand at answering all 4 of the ones that I received. Those of you that had short assignments due today and didn't do them, well, that's not going to help with class participation and short assignment credit for the semester. But such is life. Let's go to, I thought I'd start with something that Leo Wheeler submitted. And I thought I'd give a response, a Kantian type response to what Leo Wheeler said. I want to sort of speak on behalf of Kant's ethics here. So what did Leo Wheeler write? Leo Wheeler writes the following, and I quote from Leo Wheeler. He writes, "An example given by Kant is the issue of charity. Deciding to never give to charity because it conflicts with your own beliefs is wrong, because if no one gave to charity, then the charities could never help people." Let me just remind you, right, that Kant's got this principle of universalizability, and I'm going to be talking about his principle of universalizability in more detail today. But he's got the principle of universalizability, which is an expression of the categorical imperative. And this principle says act only on those maxims which we could reasonably will to be a universal law to be followed by all people, right? And Kant argues that that principle of universalizability, which again is a way of expressing the categorical imperative, it entails that we have an obligation to help people in need, to give to charity, at least at some moments in our lives. And Kant argues that we have this obligation because you cannot reasonably will living your life in such a way that you never give assistance to others. And you cannot reasonably will that, says Kant, because each one of us wants to be helped in our own time of need. And so we cannot reasonably will that no one ever help others, because we would all want and will to be helped in our own time of need. And if nobody's giving to others, then that's contrary to our own will, our own desire to be helped when we're in need. And Leo Wheeler makes reference to that point here. But Wheeler goes on and he writes, admittedly, the giving to charity example does give a good push to the principle of universalizability. But Wheeler says, but I still find it hard to get behind the principle of universalizability. Wheeler says, while most people would agree that donating to charity is morally right, that does not mean that everybody will give to charity. Morals and ethics are not universal, and trying to apply them to everyone would leave you stuck with no answer for any situation. So, Wheeler's making this point that, right, while, he's making a point, many would agree that we should give to charity. And then Wheeler says that this does not mean that everyone will give to charity. And he says morals and ethics are not universal. I guess the idea here from Leo is that not everybody agrees about what is universalizable, or not everybody will agree about what we can reasonably will for everyone to do. Here's my Kantian response, Leo. This is my Kantian response. Just because not everyone will agree with and accept a principle that is reasonably universalized, it does not mean that the principle is wrong. It might just be an indication that some people are either immoral or irrational or both. Right? For instance, suppose Kant is correct in the belief that we can reasonably will that everyone give to charity on some occasions in their lives. Suppose he's right about that. Right? After all, failure to will that. Well, what do I have here? Failure to will this is inconsistent with one's own desire for one's own help in time of need, right? In other words, I'm so sorry, I'm stumbling with this. But let me just say, Kant might be right that we can reasonably will that everyone give to charity on some occasions in their lives. Again, why is that reasonable according to Kant? Because you cannot reasonably will that no one give to charity, because that's inconsistent with your own desire to be helped in your time of need. Now, if some people refuse to give to charity, despite the fact that giving to charity is reasonably expected of everyone. Now, if some people refuse to give to charity, this does not mean that there is something wrong with the conclusion that it's reasonable to expect everyone to give. This is a moral expectation. When I say it's reasonable to expect everyone to give to charity, that's a moral expectation of what I think people ought to do. It's a moral expectation. It's not a predictive expectation. It's not a prediction of how people will act, right? I can reasonably will that each of my students will write the term paper if they are able to do so. But this is a moral expectation. Some students will choose not to do the term paper even if they can do it. But it does not follow that my moral expectation of each student is foolish or unreasonable. Those who fail to ever give to charity, when they fail to do so, they might just be irrational or immoral. But this does not mean that the moral expectation that they do so, is misguided or unreasonable. See what I'm getting at? So Leo Wheeler, you're right that not everybody is going to give to charity. You're right about that. But still, that doesn't mean it does not mean that I cannot have a reasonable moral expectation that everyone do give to charity in living their lives, right? So that's what I would say in defense of Kant. Let's take a look at someone else. Jake Schmidt, he wrote, and he wrote the following concerning Kant's ethics. Jake Schmidt writes, "One potential objection that I have to Kant's ethics can be visualized through someone like Robin Hood. In the story of Robin Hood, he steals from the rich and gives to the poor." This reminds me of something that Mitchell Dvorak was talking about Robin Hood cases and something he wrote. Right? But Robin Hood, he steals from the rich and he gives to the poor. John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism would say that this stealing is creating much more happiness than pain. By stealing just a fraction of the wealth of the rich, Robin Hood can make thousands happier. Kant would say that this action is wrong, right? Because it universalizes stealing for everyone, but would such an action be taken to universalize all stealing or only from the rich? At the same time, the rich should be universalizing donating to charities and the poor. If a rich person were faced with the principle of philanthropy, they should act on it because it is reasonable to believe that philanthropy should be universalized. Stealing from the rich and giving to the poor is similar to philanthropy, except it isn't voluntary. So this, to me, seems to create a minor contradiction to Kant's ethics. That was a mouthful, and I think, Jake, the way it's written, it can be a bit confusing. Here's what I think Jake is getting at, and here's what I want to say about this. Jacob Schmidt says that Kant would object to stealing, even if it is stealing from the rich to give to the poor. Right? Jake, I think you would agree that stealing from the rich to give to the poor, that's something that Kant would not support. After all, it would be treating the rich as mere means to helping the poor, treating them as mere tools, right, to steal from them against their will. I just said that Jake Schmidt is right about this. Kant would object to stealing from the rich to give to the poor. Kant would say that you cannot reasonably will that everyone steal because you would not want people stealing from you. Now, Jake Schmidt wonders if this is inconsistent with Kant's claim that people have the obligation to help those in need. Kant does say that we have the obligation to help people in need. If the rich should be giving to the poor, then why is it not okay to just take their wealth and give to the poor? But Jake himself, in his writing prompt, he notes that there's an important difference between taking the wealth from the rich and the rich giving some of their wealth to the poor. Right? When the money is stolen, it is not voluntarily given by the wealthy, as Jake points out. Rather, the wealthy are treated as mere means when their wealth is taken from them. And this violates what I will talk about as the principle of ends, which is another way to express the categorical imperative. And no one wants to be treated as a mere means, as a mere tool. And so you cannot reasonably will that everyone steal, even if it is just stealing from the rich to give to the poor. Right? Because when you steal from the rich to give to the poor, you're treating the rich as a mere means to alleviate the suffering of the poor. Right? If you steal their property. Right? And if you're treating the rich as mere means to alleviating the suffering of the poor, right? And given that you can't reasonably will that we treat everyone as mere means, because nobody wants to be, or nobody wills to be treated as mere means themselves, then stealing from the rich to give to the poor is a violation of Kantian principles of ethics. And so I don't think that the claim that we should not steal from the rich to give to the poor, I don't think that's a violation. I don't think that creates any inconsistency in the Kantian ethics, you see. Now, I will say, here's something I find interesting, Jake, about the issue that you're raising. Robin Hood was involved in stealing from the rich to give to the poor. This actually leads to me to have some interesting questions and puzzles regarding taxation of the rich by the government. What should the Kantian say about taxation imposed upon the wealthy to provide a welfare state and a welfare system, or to provide health insurance for the poor who can't afford it? Would Kantian ethics, would it support a welfare state? Now, one of the things that could be said here is that as long as there is taxation across the board, so that it's not only the rich that are having to pay these taxes for welfare and pay these taxes for education and pay these taxes for health care, as long as it's not only the rich that are being taxed to provide services for the poor, as long as the middle and lower classes are paying a segment of their money to this, then there's the universality to the practice that gives legitimacy to taxation that, say, is not there when the rich are being targeted to steal from, to provide for the poor. You see what I'm getting at? So maybe taxation to support a welfare system can be defended on Kantian grounds, especially if that taxation is universally applied to all citizens within the government, or within a nation or state. It's a question that naturally arises, I think, when we think about the Robin Hood case. I think we're naturally led to wonder about what about taxation that leads to welfare and public education and public health measures, etc. Anyway, let's look at another. Alex Tomes. What did Alex Tomes write? Well, I have it here. Alex Tomes. Alex Tomes, she's also concerned about the Kantian ethics, the categorical imperative, perhaps the principle of universalizability is on her mind. She presents what she thinks is a potential problem for this Kantian ethics. Alex Tomes writes, consider a madman named Jared, who honestly and truly believes the categorical imperative, kill Mary, is a morally correct action to take. For instance, maybe Jared believes it is also acceptable for somebody to kill him. According to Kant, at this point, Jared is correct in making kill Mary his personal maxim, as long as he honestly and truly believes that it would be morally acceptable for someone to do the same to him. However, to an outsider like us, Jared is clearly not justified in killing Mary based on his maxim, right? And so, what is Alex Tomes getting at? Alex Tomes is saying, look, somebody might say killing others or killing Mary is universalizable because, after all, I can reasonably will that other people be allowed to commit murder. After all, I'm willing to let other people try and kill me. If I'm willing to let other people try and kill me, then I can reasonably will that it's all right for people to kill, and it's all right for me to kill Mary. In defense of Kant, if I'm Kant, if I'm Immanuel Kant, I think I'm going to say this is not a good criticism. Indeed, a madman like Jared might think we can reasonably will killing others. After all, Jared is willing to be killed himself. But this is not reasonably willing that everyone act on the principle that killing is okay. It is unreasonably willing that everyone act on this principle. Just because Jared is willing to let others try to kill him, it does not follow that his willingness to allow this is reasonable. For one thing, to be killed by another is to be used as a mere means to their own wishes, and no one can reasonably will to be used by others in this way. It is contrary to our own natures as free and rational beings to be subject to the will of another, right? If Jared says, oh, I'm willing to let people try and kill me, right? That's an unreasonable willing of Jared. And, and so he cannot reasonably use that to justify the rationality of willing that it's okay for everyone to commit murder, right? Because, Jared's being irrational about what he wants for himself. Nobody can reasonably want to be treated as mere means by others, to be subject to the will of others. That's contrary to our own natures as human beings. There's something else I want to say about this kind of criticism of Kantian ethics, Alex. I would note as well that any ethical theory can be mistakenly or foolishly applied, leading to bad consequences. But that does not mean that there's a problem with the theory. For example, utilitarianism can be foolishly applied. A utilitarian, right? Imagine a utilitarian might think that drinking and driving is not very dangerous. And such a utilitarian might think that drinking and driving somehow increases total happiness in society. And so he might be led to drink and drive, and he might encourage other people to drink and drive. But this does not mean that there's a problem with utilitarianism. It just means that this particular person is foolishly using what might otherwise be a perfectly good theory to draw the wrong conclusion. And so Jared also might be foolishly and confusedly applying Kantian ethics to get to the wrong conclusion, right? So the kind of criticism that is being made of Kant's ethics here, right? It could be made, this kind of criticism could be made against any theory of ethics, right? Because, of course, any theory of ethics can be misapplied, misused to get bad results. But that doesn't mean that there's a problem with every ethical theory, because, again, any theory can just be confusedly or mistakenly applied, right? Or look at it this way as well. Somebody might be confused about how to apply certain mathematical principles, or somebody might be confused about how to apply certain sorts of scientific principles. But just because somebody confusedly applies a mathematical or scientific principle, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with the principle. It might just mean that the person applying the principle is confused about what the principle entails, or is crazy, or doesn't have their facts right. But the scientific or mathematical principles might be perfectly legitimate indeed. So anyway, that's what I would say about this. One last commentary I'd like to respond to. This comes from Max Velo. And Max Velo also raises an interesting point here. And Velo raises an issue that could raise doubts about Kant's principle of universalizability. And again, I will talk more about the principle of universalizability as well as the principle of ends in a moment. But Max Velo writes the following, and I quote from Max Velo. He says, "There is a problem with the principle of universalizability." Velo says, "Not all actions that are good or right can be willed universally and for all people." Velo says, "Imagine that I explain that all people should eat an apple a day to stay healthy, which seems trivial, but helps one gain vitamins that they need." Velo continues, "I would will that all people eat an apple every day, believing it is morally right for me to eat an apple. However, not all people can eat apples every day. Some are deathly allergic to apples, and if everyone ate an apple every day, we would run out of apples. Thus, I cannot reasonably will that everyone eat an apple a day, thus making eating apples morally wrong." And I think Velo's point is that obviously if Velo wants to eat an apple a day, that seems perfectly ethical. And if I want to eat an apple a day, that seems perfectly ethical. And Velo's saying, but look, neither Velo nor I can reasonably will that everyone eat an apple a day, because if everyone did it, soon we'd run out of apples. And, Vilo's point is that, but this is absurd, right? So Vilo's pointing out that Kant's conclusion would suggest that it's wrong for him and me to eat an apple a day, but it's obviously okay for us to eat an apple a day. And so Kant's ethics is screwed up here. So what do I want to say about this? I said, look, this is an interesting point. Right? I consider the maxim. Here I am. I'm thinking that maybe I want to live my life in such a way that I eat an apple a day. I consider the maxim. I will eat an apple every day. Can I reasonably will that everyone eat an apple a day? Kant would have me consider that in deciding whether it's right for me to eat an apple a day. Jake said, no, I cannot reasonably will that everyone eat an apple a day because there are not enough apples to go around. So on Kant's ethics, eating an apple a day is wrong, but that seems absurd. So we should reject Kant's ethics. I think that's what Vilo's pushing. Quite interesting. Look, so how could Kant be defended here? I think Kant's best move is change the maxim. Consider this maxim, right? I will eat the healthiest foods I am able to eat. There's the maxim. I will eat the healthiest foods I am able to eat. Now, can I reasonably will that everyone act on the maxim that says, I will eat the healthiest foods I am able to eat? Can I reasonably form the moral expectation that everyone will eat the healthiest foods that they're able to eat? Notice I say that they're able to eat. Seems to me, yes, I can will this, right? I can will that everybody eat the healthiest foods available for them to eat. And this will allow that I can eat an apple a day if they are available. Now you might say, but not everyone can eat the healthiest foods. Some people are too poor, some people don't have access to healthiest foods, etc. You might say, but not everyone can eat the healthiest foods. So you cannot reasonably will that everyone do this. But notice, the maxim I consider says, I will eat the healthiest foods I am able to eat. Right? Thus, if somebody does not eat healthy because he is unable to, because he can't afford it or the healthiest foods are not available, if someone does not eat the healthy foods because he's unable to, that's not a violation of the maxim that I'm universalizing here, which says, I will eat the healthiest foods I am able to eat. And again, since I can reasonably will that everyone eat the healthiest foods available to them, then it will be ethical for me to eat the healthiest foods available to me. And since eating an apple a day is consistent with my eating the healthiest foods available to me, then I can rightfully and justifiably eat an apple a day. I think Kant would likely make this move in his defense. Now, having said all this, notice that I've changed the maxim here to avoid the criticism that Vilo is making here. I've moved away from the maxim, I will eat an apple every day, to another maxim, I will eat the healthiest foods available to me. I've changed the maxim to avoid the problem that Max Vilo is talking about. And this is the best way I know to try and answer Vilo. I will admit this, Max. I think that the move I'm making to defend Kant here, shifting the maxim to avoid the problem, I think that itself could lead to some other potential problems with Kant's ethics. The fact that we can shift maxims to universalized principles. This has been used to make standard and significant criticisms of Kant's ethics. So I've given you my answer, Max, but I think my answer could lead to other problems with Kant's ethics. And I think historically in the literature, people have pressed these problems against the principle of universalizability. So I just end with that. Let's move on. I wanted you guys for today to go back and review the excerpts we have from Kant's ethics, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about the principle of ends and principle of universalizability. I think some of these short assignments, students have gone forward and looked into some of the stuff they actually wanted to cover for today. Let's do a little bit of review. Again, if you've got a copy of my outline, and if you could put your outline up in one window on your computer and then listen to what I'm saying, or watch me in another window, that might be helpful. But look, as I said last time, Kant believes that there is but one moral principle that we need to follow in living our lives. And if we always obey this principle, we will always be led to act rightly. And this principle is the categorical imperative. As a categorical imperative, right, is an unconditional command which demands the same things of everyone. A categorical imperative is not a hypothetical or conditional command. Categorical imperatives are not telling you what you ought to do to be happy or to get ahead in life, etc. Categorical imperatives, they demand the same things of everyone, and they are issued unconditionally. Now, Kant famously expresses the categorical imperative. He articulates it in different ways, and I want today to consider two of the ways that he expresses it. One expression of the categorical imperative is what we call the principle of universalizability, right? Or PU, right? P for principle, U for universalizability. This principle states that we should act, right? That we should only act on those maxims or those principles which we could reasonably will to become a universal law to be followed by all persons. What this means is that to know if your action is right, then before acting, you should consider the principle you're acting on, and you should ask yourself this question: could I reasonably will that all persons act on this principle? And if the answer to that is no, then the action is wrong. And if the answer is yes, I could reasonably will that everybody act on my principle, then the action is morally acceptable. So for instance, if I show up to take a mathematics exam and I realize that I don't know the material at all, and I consider cheating by copying answers off of the student sitting next to me, then I should ask myself, can I reasonably will that everyone act on the principle which says copy exam answers of other students? And the answer here is obviously no. And why is that? It is because if everyone tried to do this, no one would have the right answers to copy off of. Right? So, right, I consider this. Can I reasonably will that everyone act on the principle which says copy exam answers of other students? Well, imagine if everybody acted on this. Well, then what would happen? Well, I would show up to the test. I would look to the kid's exam who's sitting next to me, but that kid would be acting on the same principle, and he would be looking at the exam of the woman sitting next to him, and she would be looking at the exam of the kid sitting next to her, and so on. And so no one would have anyone to cheat off of if everybody acted on the principle which says I will cheat by copying the exam of the student sitting next to me. And so it would be self-defeating for everyone to try and copy off the exam of the student sitting next to him, because no one would, right? Because if everyone did this, no one would be there with the right answers, and they would all fail. And this is an example of mine that I've made up. Kant himself, in the reading, he actually takes that principle of universalizability and he applies it to 4 different cases. Those are 4 famous cases. In the reading, Kant applies this. I'm going to discuss 2 of the cases. In one case, Kant considers a man who desperately needs money and who considers making a lying promise to his friend that if his friend gives him $2,000 today, he will pay back his friend within a week. And he makes this promise, right? And he's contemplating making this promise while knowing that he won't be able to pay his friend back the $2,000 within a week. Kant says that to make such a lying promise is wrong, and he explains its wrongness in terms of the principle of universalizability. The idea here is that you cannot reasonably will that everyone act on this principle, because if everyone did act on the principle that it's okay to make lying promises, it would be self-defeating, because then no one would believe any promises, right? And they would then never make loans to people who make promises to pay back loans. If everybody felt that it was okay to make these lying promises, pretty soon you wouldn't be able to successfully make a promise to repay a loan, because everybody would suspect you of lying, and then nobody would be giving loans. It's self-defeating. And so it's wrong to make a lying promise, says Kant, because it violates the principle of universalizability. You can't reasonably will that everybody be doing this, because pretty soon nobody would believe your promises. In another case, Kant talks about a man who considers living in such a way that he never gives to charity. Kant says this would be wrong. And he also explains the wrongness of this in terms of the principle of universalizability. Kant says that you cannot reasonably will that everyone refuse to give to charity. You cannot reasonably will that everybody refuse to give aid to those in need, because this conflicts with your own will, your own desire to be helped, if you are ever in need of the assistance of others yourself. And so Kant thinks that we all have this obligation to give to those in need, at least from time to time in our lives, because you can't reasonably well living a life in which you never give assistance to others. Now I want to talk about what I labeled as the principle of ends, right? The categorical imperative, it can also be expressed in terms of the principle of ends. This principle states that we should always treat humanity in our own person or in that of others as an end, and never as mere means. To treat somebody as a mere means is to treat them as a mere tool to one's own ends, without showing respect for their own concerns and their own capacity for free and informed consent. To treat somebody as an end is to treat others with respect, acknowledging them as free beings with their own goals and concerns. Right? Look, rape and murder and theft, these would all count as classic violations of the principles of ends, right? Right? To commit rape or murder or theft, you're treating somebody as a mere tool to get what you want from them, whether some twisted sexual gratification or to get their property from them, right? But to treat somebody as an end is to respect another being's capacity to give free and informed consent to what you're doing with them, right? Right? Now, some of you might think that, well, we use people all the time. I mean, some of you might regard yourselves as using me to get a good grade in philosophy or using me to get a philosophical education. But in using me to get an education, you're not treating me as mere means, because I have freely and voluntarily signed a contract to teach this class, right? Or when you use the waiter at the restaurant to bring food to you, you are not treating that person as mere means, because that person is voluntarily taking on the job of being a waiter, right? But you do use people as mere means when you enslave them against their wishes, or you rape them or steal from them, right? Because those are things that they're not consenting to of their own free will. Now, what Kant does is Kant goes back to the same four cases in his ethical writings, and he revisits them and applies the principle of ends, which is just for him another expression of the categorical imperative, and he applies that principle of ends to those same four cases. I'll talk briefly about the lying promise case again. Kant says that, look, the lying promise is a violation of the principle of ends, right? Because a person being lied to is treated as a mere means to getting money, and by lying to him, you don't respect his or her capacity to freely and informedly consent to giving you the money, right? The situation here would be totally different if you told the person the truth that you would not be able to pay them back, and then they give you the money, knowing that you won't be able to give it back. In that situation, if you told them the truth, then they could freely and informedly choose whether to give you the money or not. Kant also talks about a case of suicide. And Kant clearly thinks that suicide is immoral. And Kant talks about how it's a violation of the categorical imperative, and he applies the principle of ends here. Kant describes a situation where you have a man who's very unhappy with his life, and this man considers killing himself to end his unhappiness. Kant says that this violates the principle of ends. In killing oneself to avoid unhappiness, you treat your own humanity as a mere means to the end of alleviating your suffering. And thus Kant says that suicide is in this way a violation of the principle of ends, and it is wrong, right? The person who kills himself because he's unhappy in life, he's treating his own human being, his own humanity, as a mere means, and he's destroying his humanity to alleviate his suffering. Again, that's to treat this thing that deserves respect in a disrespectful way by destroying the humanity. You treat your own humanity as a mere tool to alleviating your suffering. And so Kant finds suicide to be wrong. And I think it's clear as well that Kant would find people ending their own lives when they're suffering from a terminal illness that they're going to die from anyway. I think this would be voluntary euthanasia. And I think Kant would regard that and physician-assisted suicide as immoral as well. And interestingly, utilitarian moral philosophy could easily justify voluntary euthanasia in many cases. And I think when you think about Kant's views on suicide and contrast Kant's ethics with utilitarianism, I think you see a clear contrast between these two ethical theories. So I just would note that to you all. Now, one other thing I want to talk about is that Kant does famously maintain that the principle of universalizability and the principle of ends, these are two different ways of expressing the one thing that he calls the categorical imperative. And I think that this has often puzzled philosophers, and I think rightfully so. It's puzzled philosophers because it's not immediately obvious that the principle of ends and the principle of universalizability are really just two ways of saying the same thing. It's really not obvious. And it seems to me that perhaps Kant was led to think that these are two ways of saying the same thing. Perhaps he was led to say this because I do think you can derive the principle of ends from the principle of universalizability, right? So that if the principle of universalizability is true, the principle of ends can be shown to follow logically. But of course, I would point out that just because you can derive the one principle from the other, it doesn't mean that they are actually equivalent principles. I do think it's puzzling that Kant says that these are two ways of expressing one idea, the categorical imperative. That's not obvious. But I thought I'd talk a little bit about how you can derive the principle of ends from the principle of universalizability. Right? So how does that work? Let's look at it this way. And I'm in the last section of the outline. I would encourage you to look at that. Suppose I am contemplating treating somebody as a mere means. That is, I'm contemplating using somebody against their will for my own purposes. According to the principle of universalizability, to do this would be right only if I can reasonably will that everyone treat persons as mere means. But I cannot reasonably will that everyone treat persons as mere means, because this would legitimize other people treating me as mere means. And I cannot reasonably will that I be treated as mere means. So treating people as mere means does not conform to the principle of universalizability. Therefore, we should never treat people as mere means. Therefore, the truth of the principle of universalizability implies the truth of the principle of ends. And so that's how you can derive the principle of ends from the principle of universalizability. And I've got this out, included in my outline here. And maybe Kant was led to think that, maybe he was led to think, these principles amount to the same thing. Maybe he was led to that idea because you can derive the principle of ends from the principle of universalizability. But I would point out, again, just because you can derive the one from the other, it really doesn't mean that they are equivalent principles. But there you have it. Look, for next time, as I said, I want you guys to watch Gattaca. You should be able to get, I'm pretty sure I've looked into this. You can get it on Amazon Prime. It may be available on Netflix. I think it's available to rent on YouTube. But watch Gattaca, and I will give you, later today, I'll send you a writing assignment in which I will indicate what I want you to do. And in general, what I'm going to want you to do is to try your hand at applying the utilitarian moral philosophy and the Kantian ethics to what we see in Gattaca. I also will invite you to include a paragraph where you share some of your own thoughts on some of the moral issues that arise in the movie. I hope you enjoy the movie. Personally, I love it. I think it's a great work of science fiction. Anyway, enough said. See you guys. Be safe out there. Bye-bye.